Lila Merrin stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, with her hands locked so tightly in front of her apron that her fingers had gone numb. Trying not to flinch each time the judge's laughter rolled across the yard and straight through her chest. And if she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend she was just another girl passing through town, instead of one of the women lined up like unwanted stock for the men to stare at. "Pick any wife for free?" Judge Harlan Briggs sneered from his high wooden chair, his voice booming over the snickers and muttered jokes. "Some of 'em might even be worth the trouble." The men laughed, but not at the girls who stood straight-backed and pretty in borrowed dresses. They laughed at Lila, at the way her dress hung wrong on her thin frame, at the faint, nervous stutter that tripped her tongue when the clerk had called her name, at the fact that everyone knew she was only there because her aunt had shoved her forward and hissed, "You're eating my bread and bringing me nothing back. At least make yourself useful once." Lila had never wanted marriage, not like this, not to men who came for a bargain instead of a bride. But the law had teeth, and the judge enjoyed using them, and once her name was written on his list, there had been nowhere left to hide. "No dowry, no beauty, no prospects," one ranch hand snorted under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "They ought to pay a man to take that one." Lila's cheeks burned, but she kept her chin level, pressing the humiliation deep where no one could see it, because if she let it show, they would only laugh harder. She knew what they saw when they looked at her. A girl who spoke too softly, who worked too hard for too little, whose only value lay in how easily she could be overlooked. That was the joke today. Line up the desperate women, let the men pick the best, then point and howl at the girl no one would ever choose. It was all a game to them until he arrived. Colt Renshaw rode into the yard without fanfare, dust soft on his dark coat, hat low over his brow, and the easy noise of the crowd muted by half when they noticed him, because men with his kind of reputation didn't come to town for foolish spectacles. He dismounted without hurry, tied his horse, and walked toward the line of women with a gait that made men shift out of his path without realizing they'd moved. The judge's smile sharpened. "Renshaw," he called, "come to claim yourself a wife for free?" The crowd chuckled, hungry for whatever came next. Colt didn't answer right away. His gaze moved past the painted smiles and practiced poses, past the prettiest dress and the boldest eyes, landing instead on Lila, the girl with her fingers dug into her own hands, shoulders drawn tight, eyes trying and failing not to flinch under everyone's mockery. For one heartbeat, she thought he would pass her by like all the others, and some small, bruised part of her prepared to be grateful for that mercy. Instead, he stopped squarely in front of her, close enough that she could see the fine dust at the edge of his collar and the quiet, assessing steadiness in his eyes. And when he finally spoke, the yard fell quiet enough to hear every word. "I'll take this one," Colt Renshaw said, not as if he were choosing a joke, but as if he were stating a fact the world would just have to accept. "The girl you've all spent the morning laughing at?" For a long, stunned heartbeat, no one moved. Not the girls lined up beside Lila, not the men who had spent the morning whispering about the free wife sale, not even Judge Harlan Briggs, whose grin slipped so quickly it looked painful, because Colt Renshaw, choosing the girl everyone mocked, wasn't just unexpected. It ruined the joke they had been savoring since dawn. Lila felt every eye slam into her like a shove, heat rising to her cheeks even as her breath thinned, because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had braced herself for humiliation. Yes, for being ignored, of course, but not for being pointed at by the only man in the territory who terrified half the room with a single look. Colt didn't seem bothered by the silence, or the outrage simmering beneath it. He kept his hat low, his stance easy but unshakable, like he'd planted his boots into decisions he didn't intend to explain. Judge Briggs leaned forward in his chair, fake amusement stretching across his face. Renshaw, he drawled, you do know you're allowed to pick any woman here, not just— He flicked his eyes toward Lila's thin shoulders. The charity cases. Colt didn't turn. I picked. A few men laughed, but it wasn't the sharp, mocking laughter from before. It was the uneasy kind, the kind that comes when people don't understand where the danger has shifted. Lila's pulse hammered so loudly she thought the whole yard could hear it. She tried to speak, to ask him why. Why her? Why this? But her voice snagged on the first syllable the way it always did when panic closed in on her throat. Colt noticed. His gaze flicked to hers, steady and calm in a way that didn't fit anything she'd ever been told about him. He didn't look impatient. He didn't look annoyed. He simply waited, which somehow made the words harder to find, until she finally managed to whisper, "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said, quiet but sure, as if he were answering a question she had never asked. Behind them, the judge slapped the desk with exaggerated cheer. "Well, now let's not drag this spectacle out. Papers are signed, marriage is binding, and—" "Papers aren't signed yet," Colt cut in, turning his head just enough to pin Briggs with a stare that drained the man's confidence in a blink. "And if you try to rush her, this ends differently than you want." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one challenged Colt Renshaw, not even the judge who pretended he ran the town. Lila's aunt pushed forward then, her voice sharp enough to slice. "She'll sign. She knows where she belongs." The words stung, not because they were new, but because they were too familiar. Colt shifted, placing himself just enough in front of Lila to force her aunt to meet his eyes instead of hers. "She'll speak for herself." The simplicity of it knocked the air from Lila's lungs. No one had ever said that for her, not once, not in 20 years. She lifted her eyes, hands trembling, and the entire yard seemed to tilt as everyone leaned in, waiting to see whether the girl they laughed at would embarrass herself again. Her throat closed. Her aunt smirked. Judge Briggs looked ready to snatch the pen and force it into her hand. Colt didn't push. He didn't rush her. He just waited. And something inside her, something small and buried and long ignored, shifted like a door creaking open. "I'll go with him," she whispered. The words weren't strong, but they were hers. The judge blinked, annoyed he wouldn't get his spectacle. Colt gave a single slow nod. "Then we're done here." And just like that, in front of a town that had built its laughter on her back, Lila Merrin walked away beside a man she did not know, yet somehow trusted more than anyone who had claimed to know her all her life. The walk from the courthouse yard to Colt Renshaw's horse was barely 30 steps, yet to Lila, it felt like crossing a lifetime built on every whisper that had ever been used to shrink her. Too quiet, too plain, too nervous, too nothing. And she could feel those same eyes trailing behind her, waiting for her to stumble so they could confirm the story they had always told about the girl no one would ever choose. Colt didn't rush her. He adjusted his long stride to match hers without drawing attention to it, and the quiet consideration in that small act unsettled her more deeply than the moment he'd chosen her, because men like him didn't soften for anyone. Yet he did so effortlessly. When they reached his horse, Lila froze, hands twisting together in panic because she had never been taught to ride. Her aunt had always said it was for girls men might want someday, and the embarrassment rose hot in her cheeks as she shook her head. Her stutter snagged painfully through her explanation, but Colt didn't sigh, didn't glance around at the crowd that still lingered like vultures, didn't show an ounce of impatience. Instead, he simply stepped to the saddle and said quietly, "I'll lift you. You don't have to do anything but breathe." And something in that steady tone loosened the fear coiled inside her. When he lifted her, his hands were firm but careful, not claiming her the way other men handled courthouse brides, but as though she was something fragile he refused to mishandle. And when he mounted behind her, the whispers rained down like pebbles. She'll cry before sundown. He'll return her within a week. Why her? Why that one? And she felt every cruel word press against her ribs until Colt leaned close enough for only her to hear and said, "They don't know you." The simple truth of it hit harder than any insult. As they rode toward the open road, Judge Briggs called after them with a mocking bark, "No refunds, Renshaw, even for the broken ones." And Lila flinched as if slapped. But Colt didn't turn, didn't shout, didn't take the bait. He only spoke again, calm cutting sharper than anger. "You're not broken, Lila. They just don't know where to look." Her breath wavered, her heart unknotted, and for the first time in her 20 years, she didn't shrink from someone's words. She straightened. And as the courthouse vanished behind them and the quiet ranch road stretched ahead, she realized she wasn't being dragged into a life she didn't choose. She was being given the first beginning that might ever belong to her. The ride to Colt Renshaw's ranch felt longer than it was, not because of the distance, but because every jolt of the horse reminded Lila she had stepped out of the only life she'd ever known, and into one she didn't understand. And by the time the weathered outline of his homestead came into view, high post fence, quiet barn, a single cabin standing against the open land, her heart rattled like something trapped between fear and a strange, fragile steadiness she didn't recognize. Colt dismounted first, offering his hand without grabbing or guiding, letting her take it or refuse it, and when she placed her fingers in his, he lifted her down with the same careful strength he'd shown all morning, a steadiness that made her feel seen instead of handled. She expected him to lead her inside like a man claiming property, expected the roughness she'd seen in other courthouse unions, doors slammed behind new brides, barked orders, a life rearranged without warning. But instead, Colt stood still, letting her look at the house with its unpainted boards and quiet windows, as if giving her time to decide whether she would step toward it at all. "There's a room for you," he said, nodding toward the cabin. "It's not much, but it's yours." The word yours landed with more weight than anything he'd said yet, and she hesitated because no one had ever offered her a space that belonged to her alone. Not her aunt, not her father, not the world that had always told her she was lucky just to be tolerated. When she finally stepped inside, the cabin was nothing like the homes she'd cleaned for richer families. It was simple, sturdy, lived in, with shelves lined neatly, boots placed with intention, and a quiet that felt less like emptiness and more like peace. Colt stood just inside the doorway, not crossing into her space, waiting as though he refused to assume anything about her comfort. "I don't expect anything from you," he said quietly, as if reading the panic she was trying to swallow. "Not work, not what the town expects. You don't owe me for choosing you." Lila turned to him, her hands tightening around the small bundle she'd brought, nothing more than a dress, a comb, and a ribbon too worn to be pretty. "Then why pick me?" she asked, her voice barely holding. Colt's eyes softened with something she couldn't name. "Because you were the only one they treated like a joke," he said, "and I won't stand by while a man like Briggs decides someone's worth." The honesty in it cracked something inside her, the years of swallowing humiliation suddenly too heavy to hold, and she had to look away before emotion betrayed her. Colt didn't press, didn't try to comfort her, didn't move closer. He simply nodded once toward the small room and said, "Take your time. This house doesn't expect you to become anything you're not." And for the first time in her life, Lila stepped into a space where her existence wasn't a burden, a bargain, or a source of shame. It was simply allowed, Word traveled faster than dust on the prairie, and by noon the next day, Red Hollow had already twisted Lila's disappearance into a dozen ugly versions of itself. Renshaw dragged her off. She fainted on the ride. He only picked her to shame the judge. She'll be back by sundown crying for her aunt. And each rumor carried the same sharp edge. The town wasn't done laughing at her, not while she was finally somewhere they couldn't watch her fall. Lila spent the morning quietly in her small room, the simple bed and single window feeling more like a secret than a shelter, trying to understand the strange lightness in her chest as she folded the same few belongings she had always been mocked for. Outside, she could hear Colt fixing a fence rail, his steady movements oddly reassuring, not because she needed him, but because he didn't demand anything from her. When she finally stepped onto the porch, Colt looked up just long enough to see her, then returned to his work, letting her choose how close or how far she wanted to stand. Another small freedom no one in her life had ever offered. "You don't have to stay inside," he said without looking over, his tone neither commanding nor encouraging, just factual. "This land's big enough to breathe in." Lila walked toward the fence, touching the rough wood as if testing the idea of belonging. "They're talking about me," she said softly. Colt nodded once. "They always talk. Doesn't make any of it true." The steadiness in his voice made her chest tighten again. She had spent her whole life being defined by people who never bothered to know her, and hearing someone dismiss their judgment so easily felt foreign, almost dangerous. Before she could answer, a wagon approached fast along the road, kicking up dust like smoke, and Lila's stomach knotted the moment she recognized the deep blue shawl flapping from the seat. Her aunt. The wagon stopped hard, and her aunt climbed down with a fury that could have set dry grass on fire. "You ungrateful girl!" she spat, marching straight toward Lila. "Pack your things. You're coming home." Lila stepped back before she could stop herself, instinct gripping her like a chain she'd worn for years. But Colt straightened slowly at the fence, wiping his hands on his trousers as he turned to face the woman. He didn't step between them, not yet, but his presence drew a heavy line in the dirt. "She's not property to collect," Colt said calmly. "She speaks for herself." Her aunt scoffed. "She's a burden. My burden. And he tricked her into coming out here." Colt's jaw tightened. "I didn't trick her, and I don't keep what doesn't want to stay." All eyes shifted to Lila, and the familiar panic surged up her throat. The kind that made her stutter, the kind that always made her small, the kind her aunt relied on to silence her. Lila opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The old humiliation rose like a bruise. "Say something," she begged herself. "Anything." Her aunt folded her arms, waiting for her to crumble. The air seemed to thicken around her, but then Colt spoke. Soft, steady, anchoring. "Breathe, Lila." She did, and when she lifted her chin, the words finally came. Not strong, not loud, but hers. I'm not going back." Her aunt blinked, stunned. Colt didn't move, but something in his eyes softened. Approval, quiet and warm. The wagon wheels creaked as her aunt stumbled back, fury tangled with disbelief. "This isn't over," she snapped. But as she climbed onto the seat and snapped the reins, Lila realized something profound. For the first time in her life, she hadn't let someone shove her back into the place they decided she belonged. And for the first time, someone had stood close enough, not to speak for her, but to make space for her to speak at all. The quiet after her aunt's departure felt heavier than the confrontation itself, settling over the yard like dust after a storm. And Lila stood there gripping the fence rail long after the wagon had vanished down the road, because part of her still couldn't believe she had said the words aloud. "I'm not going back." And another part of her was terrified of what those words meant now that they were real. Colt didn't speak, didn't rush toward her with sympathy or questions. He simply resumed checking the fence, giving her space to feel the weight of her own choice, without crowding it. That silence steadied her more than any reassurance could have, because he wasn't treating her like a fragile thing that might break. He was treating her like a person who had finally taken her own side for the first time. After several minutes, she turned toward him, drawn by the quiet certainty in his movements, and asked the question that had sat heavy in her chest since the courthouse. "Why did you pick me, Colt?" "Truly?" He straightened slowly, eyes meeting hers with the same steady calm he'd carried all morning. "Because you were the only one they wanted humiliated," he said. "And I don't let men like Briggs decide who deserves dignity." The words hit harder than she was prepared for, because no one in her life had ever spoken about her as someone worthy of protection, worthy of anything. She glanced down at her hands, remembering every time her aunt had hissed that she was a burden, every time the town girls had laughed at her stutter, every time she'd folded herself small to avoid attention she'd learned would only hurt. "They say I'm not worth much," she whispered before she could stop herself. Colt stepped closer, not invading her space, but close enough that she felt the warmth of his presence. "They're wrong." Simple, unpolished, unshakable. Lila's breath trembled. No one had ever dismissed an entire town's cruelty with such quiet conviction. "You don't even know me," she said. "I know enough," he replied. "I know what fear looks like, and you've been carrying it alone too long." He looked out toward the land, the sun dipping low behind the hills. "But fear doesn't mean weakness, Lila. It means you've survived what others wouldn't." The truth of it cracked something deep inside her, not like a wound reopening, but like a door she never knew she had. "What if I'm not what you expect?" she asked, voice thin. Colt's gaze softened in a way she had never seen in a man's eyes. "Good," he said. "I didn't pick you because of who you should be. I picked you because of who you already are." The words were so gentle they almost hurt. She turned away, hiding the sudden burn in her eyes, but Colt didn't move, didn't ease the moment, didn't fill it with anything unnecessary. He simply waited, letting her steady herself in her own time. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quieter, but it no longer shook. "I don't know what I'm doing here," she confessed. Colt nodded once. "Then we'll learn it slow." She looked at him, startled. "We?" "If you stay," he said simply, "you won't be learning alone." And with those few unpolished words, Lila felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Not hope, not yet, but the faint, early shape of it. For the first time in her life, someone wasn't trying to change her, claim her, or fix her. Someone was trying to see her, and that was something worth staying long enough to understand. By the next morning, the town of Red Hollow had transformed her simple decision, "I'm not going back," into an insult they felt personally wronged by, and Lila felt the pressure of it before she even left the porch. The air itself seemed to hold judgment. Colt saddled his horse with quiet efficiency, pausing only long enough to glance toward her small room, making sure she knew she wasn't required to join him, wasn't expected to follow, wasn't obligated to anything. But Lila stepped outside anyway. She wasn't hiding. Not today. "I need to go into town," she said softly. Colt studied her for a long heartbeat, not with doubt, but with a silent question. "Are you choosing this or being pulled by fear again?" When she nodded with steadier certainty, he gave one slow nod in return. "Then we'll ride in together." Red Hollow was already waiting. As they reached the main street, conversations stopped mid-word. Children pulled close to their mothers, and men who had laughed at her at the courthouse suddenly found other places to look. Lila's heart pounded, but she kept her chin level, Colt riding beside her like a wall of quiet protection. When they stopped at the Mercantile, Mr. Yates, the owner, came to the doorway with a look that hovered between fear and scolding. "Lila Merrin," he said, folding his arms, "it's not proper for a girl like you to be staying alone on a man's ranch." The words struck hard, not because they were new, but because this time she wasn't alone to swallow them. Colt didn't speak first. He didn't have to. Lila drew a breath, finding her voice before the shame could swallow it. "I'm not alone," she said evenly. "I'm choosing where I live." Mr. Yates stiffened. "That's not how our town works." Colt stepped forward then, his voice a quiet blade. "Then maybe the town needs to work different." Murmurs flared instantly, men shifting uneasily, women whispering behind gloved hands. A councilman approached, face pinched with disapproval. "The girl belongs with her aunt," he announced. "That's where she's always been." Lila felt the old panic clawing up her throat. Belongs. The word had trapped her for years, but before it could close around her again, she remembered Colt's voice from yesterday. They're wrong, and this time she believed him enough to try. "I don't belong to her," Lila said, her voice trembling but unbroken, "and I don't belong to any of you." A shocked silence rippled through the street. The councilman's ears reddened. "You think we're the enemy?" "I think," Lila said, "you're angry because you can't control me anymore." The truth landed like a thrown stone. One of the women gasped sharply. Someone muttered, "She's gotten bold." Someone else snapped, "Renshaw filled her head with nonsense." Colt didn't flinch. "She filled her own head," he said. "Finally." The councilman scowled, stepping closer, puffing himself up the way men did when power started slipping through their fingers. "If she stays, she'll ruin her reputation and yours." Colt's voice dropped to a level that made the entire street go still. "My reputation's not your concern, and hers is no longer yours to manage." The councilman opened his mouth again, but Lila stepped forward first, an action so small and yet so unheard of from her that it froze him mid-breath. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she whispered. And even though it wasn't shouted, wasn't bold or theatrical, it hit the street harder than anything anyone had said all morning. Because in 20 years, Lila Merrin had never spoken back, never risen, never stepped forward. But she did now, and she didn't hide behind anyone to do it. The town wasn't angry at her choice. They were angry at her becoming someone who could finally make one. By late afternoon, Red Hollow had gone from whispering about her to outright circling her, the way people gather around a fire they don't trust but can't look away from. And Lila felt the weight of every stare as she stepped out of the Mercantile with the small packet of flour she had insisted on paying for herself, even though Colt had quietly offered to cover it. She needed to buy it, needed the moment, needed to do one ordinary task without permission. Colt walked beside her without touching, without crowding, acting like her presence at his side was the most unremarkable thing in the world, even though the town saw it as a provocation. "They're rattled," he murmured, speaking low enough for only her to hear. "They're used to you apologizing just for existing." Lila tightened her grip on the flower. "They still want me to." "Maybe," Colt said. "But you're not doing it." Their steps echoed across the wooden boards, and the sound was enough to pull the attention of the women gathered outside the dressmaker's shop. Their eyes swept over Lila with a cutting mixture of pity and disdain, the kind reserved for girls too poor to dress up their shame. One of them spoke loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Poor thing, she thinks being chosen for a joke makes her special." Lila froze, breath catching in her throat. The old instinct surged. Drop your gaze, shrink, pretend you didn't hear it. But before she could default to survival, Colt's voice slid into the air like steady iron. "Keep walking," he said softly. He wasn't telling her to ignore them. He was telling her to choose herself instead of their cruelty. Lila did. She took the next step, and the next, and each one made the air heavier with disbelief. But Red Hollow wasn't done. When they reached the end of the boardwalk, a group of ranch hands blocked the path with lazy, mocking grins, the same men who had laughed at her at the courthouse. "Renshaw," one drawled. "Judge is looking to redo the picking. Claims he made a mistake letting you walk off with that." His eyes dragged over Lila like she wasn't standing there at all. Colt's jaw tensed, but his voice stayed calm. "Move." The man shrugged. "We're just saying. There's still time to trade up. Folks say you picked her as a joke anyway." Lila felt something inside her twist hard. Not pain, not fear, but something fierce and unfamiliar. She stepped forward before Colt could, voice soft but unshaking. "If I was a joke," she said, "you wouldn't be this angry that he chose me." The ranch hand blinked, thrown off by the quiet strike. Colt glanced at her, just a flicker of pride in his eyes, but said nothing, letting her hold the moment. Another man snorted. "You got a smart mouth for someone who stutters." The words cut, sharp as a hook. Lila's breath trembled, her throat tightened. The old humiliation surged. Please, please don't stutter now. But then she remembered Colt's voice on the courthouse road. "They don't know you." And she forced herself to breathe just once, long enough to find something steadier beneath the fear. "I only stutter," she said, "when I'm taught to be afraid." The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was recognition. They had taught her fear for years, and now she wasn't biting the hook anymore. The lead ranch hand swallowed. "The judge won't like this." Colt finally stepped forward, voice low and final. "Then he can come talk to me himself." The men moved aside. Not because they respected him, because they recognized something they weren't ready to fight. As Lila and Colt walked past them, Red Hollow didn't see a fragile girl trembling behind a rancher. They saw the thing they feared most, a girl they used to break, refusing to crack. By the time the sun sank low enough to spill gold across the main street, Red Hollow had decided it was done being ignored. Judge Harlan Briggs stood on the courthouse steps, like a man preparing for spectacle. The same wooden chair, the same smug grin. But this time there was no line of women, no crowd eager for entertainment. There was only him, and a fury he thought he hid well. Word had reached him. Lila Merrin had talked back, walked tall, chosen her own life, and worst of all, Colt Renshaw had let her. That was the unforgivable part. When Colt and Lila arrived at the edge of the square, the judge's voice boomed across the yard. "Renshaw, I hear you think you can skip out on legal procedures." Colt didn't slow. "There were no procedures to skip." "You took her without the signing," Briggs barked. "That makes her unclaimed, property of the court until documented properly." The word property sliced through Lila like a cold blade. It was the same word her aunt used, the same word the town used, the same word men used when speaking about women who had no power. Colt stepped slightly in front of her, protective, but never blocking her. But before he could answer, Briggs jabbed a finger toward Lila. "Girl, get up here, now!" The command slammed into her like a fist. The courthouse stairs, the crowd gathering, the expectation that she would obey. For a heartbeat, her legs almost moved on instinct. "Get up there before you're punished. Don't make a scene. Don't speak unless spoken to." But Colt's voice cut across the rising panic, soft, steady, anchoring. Lila?" She looked at him. His expression didn't shift. His voice didn't rise. He simply shook his head once. "Don't kneel to him." Something inside her snapped like a worn thread. She stepped out from behind Colt, surprising even him, and faced the judge with trembling hands but a steady spine. "I'm not property," she said. Briggs scoffed. "You were lined up to be chosen. That makes you—" "A woman," she interrupted. "Not a listing." Gasps rippled through the crowd, now forming. The judge's eyes narrowed into knives. "You will walk up these steps, girl, or I'll have the sheriff drag you." The sheriff watched from the doorway, hands at his belt, jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Not yet. Briggs slammed his palm on the railing. I said no," Lila cut in, louder this time. Her chest shook, but she didn't let the tremor win. "I walked out of that line. I walked onto Renshaw's land. I walked into town beside him. I walk where I choose." The judge's face twisted. "You're getting bold with borrowed courage." Lila swallowed hard. "I didn't borrow anything," she whispered. "I found it." Briggs lunged forward a step. That was when Colt finally moved. He wasn't loud. He wasn't dramatic. He simply stepped between them with a calm so dangerous it felt like the ground itself braced. "Touch her," Colt said softly, "and you'll answer for every woman you've ever humiliated in this town." The sheriff stepped down one stair. The councilman shifted nervously. The gathered crowd leaned forward, waiting to see who would break first. Lila didn't hide behind Colt this time. She stepped up beside him, shoulder to shoulder, chin lifted. And for the first time in Judge Briggs's long career of bullying, belittling, and bending law for spectacle, he stepped back. The town didn't cheer. It didn't need to. It witnessed something far more dangerous to men like him. A girl who refused to kneel, and a man who refused to let her stand alone. The morning rose soft and pale across Red Hollow, carrying with it a strange, unsettled quiet, the kind that follows a night when an entire town realizes a girl they once mocked has slipped from their control. And as Lila stepped onto Colt Renshaw's porch, she felt for the first time that the sun was rising with her instead of on her, a gentle warmth settling in her chest, even though she didn't yet understand what it meant. Colt saddled 2 horses with his usual steady care and motioned for her to ride with him, offering no explanation, and she followed without fear, the wind cool on her face as they crossed the pasture and climbed a low ridge overlooking the entire stretch of land he called home, the open sky vast and unbroken above them. There, he dismounted, reached into his saddlebag, and pulled out a small carved wooden box worn smooth by years of being touched with reverence, handing it to her without flourish, without demand, simply saying, "Open it if you want to," and her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid to find a deed inside. Her name written beside his, not beneath it, not as property, but as equal owner, and she stared at the page as if it might vanish if she blinked too hard, her breath catching as Colt said in a voice low and steady that the judge had wanted her ashamed, her aunt had wanted her obedient, the town had wanted her small, but he wanted her to have something none of them ever offered, a life she could claim without apology or permission. She whispered that she couldn't take something so large, something meant for someone braver, someone stronger. But Colt shook his head and told her she was stronger than she knew, that he hadn't chosen her out of pity or rebellion or to shame the judge, but because she stood up on a street where everyone expected her to crumble, because she said no for the first time in her life and meant it, because she walked beside him, not as a burden, but as someone learning to breathe in a world that had always suffocated her. Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the box to her chest, unable to speak for a moment until Colt stepped back, not closer, giving her the space to decide in her own time, and the silence settled warm around them as she finally found her voice and whispered, "I choose to stay." The words trembling but true, carrying the weight of every year she'd spent believing she wasn't worth choosing at all. Colt exhaled softly, relief slipping across his features as he told her the land was hers, just as much as his from this day forward, a partnership not forged by law or force, but by choice. And as they rode back toward the ranch together, the townspeople watching from doorways and windows, the whispers changed forever. No longer about the girl they laughed at, but about the woman who stood tall, accepted a future she once believed unreachable, and transformed her own name into something no one could ever use against her again. If this story touched your spirit, share it so that the voices of the ancestors are never forgotten. Like and subscribe to Native American Tales, where every time we bring you another cinematic legend, where pain meets purpose,